Great, thanks. And of course, if you don't want to be part of the recording, you can shut everything, your face, your audio, whatever, but I don't think it will not become a public recording. It will be just for those that ask to have it. Ciao, Monica. Okay, I think it's right time to start, so we don't have to wait too much. And just let me do the usual thing, which will be to actually start the presentation. And I have to be patient because I have difficult relationship with PowerPoints, but no, it's okay. I think I can manage. Maybe. No. What is presented? Is it presentation? Yeah, I think it should be presentation. Good. Get it. But now I cannot connect it.
Oh, cavoli. Cosa è successo?
I don't know. It's so complicated. Sorry, you have to discount my total inaptitude with PowerPoint that I never use. No. No.
Okay.
Okay.
No,
now we should make the presentation. Okay.
Sì, no, let me do a thing, please. Fammela esportare in PDF. E la prendo in PDF.
Ah, okay.
I feel it's easier.
Good. Thank you. Okay, sorry.
Dov'è la fermata?
Good.
Okay.
So this presentation, we need to.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
And maybe we can make like this, and we can
screen. Good.
Okay.
Okay. There we are. Thank you. Thank you, Costanza. I'm sorry for my deep technological limits. Okay, as I told you, first of all, let us introduce ourselves. I'm a professor here at the Foscari Department of Management and a member of the Humanities and Social Change Center since the first day. Costanza Sartoris is a PhD student at the same department. We are working together on a project of which you will see at least an important fraction. And the presentation today is a little bit, how could I say, we have to keep it small because it's very much work in progress. So we are, of course, interested to share our ideas, but especially to get any kind of feedback in this phase in which we try still to shape some of the basic concepts and tools we should use. So please be extremely, how could I say, we need your help fundamentally, and whatever comes is really good, and we hope we can get from you very useful comments. The title of the talk is awfully abstract and a little bit, how could I say, bombastic, rethinking the artificial, but it's actually rooted in very concrete material and experience. So as you will see, it really will become very soon extremely concrete and specific. Because it really starts from a peculiar case study we are conducting now in northeast India, in the Meghalaya region, where basically a tribe, the War, has developed a special kind of artifacts which are living root bridges. These are basically trees that become bridges, interacting with humans that, in a way, direct them into becoming bridges, and they can last many centuries. They go across so many generations, and they are based on a peculiar tree that we will discuss, the Ficus Elastica. Now, why these bridges? We think they are very interesting, especially in relationship to the theme we would like to develop initially, which is thinking about artificial, because they really challenge, in a way, our catalog of the word, in particular this very strong, how could I say, binary distinction we make between artificial and natural. They are clearly objects that is very hard to define as either artificial or natural. And they really invite to think to artifacts not as things standing outside us, but really as relational entities. And from this point of view, we will go through this notion of artefactualness that we think is much more helpful than the notion of artificial to think about artifacts. In order to do that, as you will see, this will be a bit more abstract, but then it will become immediately concrete. We will try to think about how objects come into life or artifacts come into life as the result of interaction among extremely heterogeneous agents, like humans, trees, sometimes even inert materials. And we will focus on the role of affordances and constraints as key concepts that help to understand how you can have communication interaction between such different and deeply heterogeneous entities. And also we will stress very much the dynamic side of it. Rather than looking at a snapshot of an artifact, it's useful to look at the whole life cycle of things, of artifacts, and the complex dynamics through which different agents, their life cycle, entangle together in creating the life cycle of things. That's the sort of basic goal, but as you will see, a large part of the seminar will be about how does it translate actually into the story of this interesting trees. Now, we are social scientists, and in social science, when you talk about artifacts and the artificial, and I would say design of the artificial, there's a clear dominant paradigm that goes back basically to Herbert Simon and to his very famous book, The Science of Artificial, that tried to provide a sort of unified framework for the design of very different things, such as markets, organizations, objects, and whatever, and even animals, as we will see. And basically, Simon tries to find a systematic way to systematize what is an artifact. And the strong claim, the fundamental claim that has deep roots in Western thought is that artifacts are distinguished from natural objects mainly because they are made for a human purpose. They are basically, how could I say, the telic dimension of artifacts is what qualifies them as artificial things, right? In the words of a very well-known theorist of design and architecture, Alexander, basically producing an artifact is an activity of synthesis of form, right? It's really driven by human intention and purpose. So in a way, what is design from this point of view is exactly this. It's a discipline, right, that studies how to synthesize form and how to create artifacts so that the shape of an object is morphology, if you want, right? It's entirely determined by the goals to which it has to be adapted, which are determined by the designer. There's another very famous expression, form follows function, that captures this idea that the shape, the form of artifacts is totally dominated by their function, which is decided in turn by the designer. It's interesting that this doesn't apply only to, how could I say, inert, clearly artificial objects like, I don't know, glass, right? It does apply also to natural, what we sometimes think of natural entities, like maybe the animals we use or the plants we use in agriculture. Because also living entities have become an integral part of the artificial in Simon's, and I would say it goes back to Bacon as an idea, in Simon's framework. Actually, you will find a very interesting source on that on Charles Darwin, who actually did a very interesting thing. If you open the origins of species, you will be maybe surprised to find that the first chapter is not about natural selection. It's all about artificial selection as a form of human design of livings, which is quite a remarkable starting point for him. And there's a lot of nice consideration on how humans have learned to shape entirely in a functional way, responding to their needs, animals and plants. Here's a quote that Darwin makes from Lord Somerville, speaking of what breeders have done for ships, right? And he says, it would seem as if they had chalked upon a wall a form perfect in itself and then have given it existence. There's this idea that animals, as we know them as domesticated animals, are the result of human design. They're artificial creatures. Now, as you probably know, there have been a lot of critical approaches to this view of the world, which is really grounded on a strong distinction between the artificial and the natural. Many of them are familiar, of course, to people in the humanities under different hats or names, but I think very similar arguments have been made also in social science. just to go quickly through this because they will help us to build a little bit how we want to address the issue of the artificial. One line of critique has been really looking at the materiality as an important dimension of things, right? And in particular, to the idea, it's called sometimes the social materiality approach, the idea that materiality is constantly socially reinterpreted as communities, people interact with objects, which means basically that the way we use the functions of objects are continuously socially redefined through interaction with those, with their material, in a way, substance, which also implies that form doesn't necessarily imply function, at least not as designed by the will of the designer. There's a sort of evolution of the use that is rooted in interaction with the materiality. A second and extremely now popular approach emphasizes another aspect of objects, which is their capacity to become agents, their agency in a way property. The most well-known formula of this is the notion of an actor network or actor network theory, but there are many variants of it, of course, and also the humanities have developed many similar ideas in what is sometimes called the object-oriented philosophy or other variants around that, in which the idea is that things are actants, so they are capable of becoming, although usefully only temporarily, agents interacting with other agents in determining basically the course of events. And whenever this intervention in the course of events is not entirely predictable, they become sort of actors. They have their own agency into human and social events. A third field, which will be also, this is important, the second takeaway is for us, of course, look more closely to the agency of non-human entities when you think about artifacts. The third very interesting idea that you might be familiar with is this notion of distributed cognition that has been emerging in the last 30 years mostly, which the idea is that things are active parts of our cognitive system, of our cognitive processes. For example, memory is crucially dependent on our usage of other objects and things to remember or to compute sometimes, or even to reason or to decide. So things are active parts of how we think. Sometimes people call about an extended mind. Two references come to mind here as far as social sciences are involved. One is Ed Hutchins. The other one is Malafouris, an archaeologist at Oxford, that has been especially looking into a notion that in a way binds this idea of distributed cognition to actor networks by saying even intentionality is not just human, it's a distributed property between humans and the things surrounding them. Finally, and I would say really most relevant to us, archaeologists and anthropologists have been forcing us to look at artifacts not the way we do it usually, by looking at simple temporal snapshots of the life of artifacts, but by looking at the whole life of artifacts, which is usually takes a very long arc of time, span of time, much longer in many cases than human life. The key idea here is that if you want to understand artifacts, you have to look at them through the lens of a sort of temporal interlocking, as Ingold has defined it, between the life cycles of humans and artifacts, right? A sort of, again, braiding of lines of life of both, which is really based on their relative duration. So different actors have different time spans and interact in different moments, twisting, if you want, the life of other components. I'm sure Maria has something to say about this kind of things. And here, there's a very useful notion, which is this notion of entanglement by Hodder, an archaeologist, that stresses that there's a sort of dialectic of dependence and dependency between human and things, how he calls it, where dependence is what things allow to do, and dependency is the way you depend on things, or vice versa, what humans allow things to do and what humans cannot do due to constraint from humans. This is the kind of background to our reflection that we will develop in a few minutes, because what we try to do is to then try to understand how, very much under the stimulus of our field observation, how we could try to move from a notion of artificial, which is very static in a way and very binary, to a more flexible and smooth and a notion, which is the notion of artefactualness, that has been recently proposed as a way to escape the sort of ontological traps of this idea of artificial and natural. Here, the basic idea is that the distinction between natural and artificial entities is not really helping us, right? Because we need a sort of continuum of situations in which natural and artificial sort of things or human-driven things intermingle. And artefactualness is a way to talk about this continuum, right? There are two important ideas about artefactualness. Sandler has been proposing this idea recently. One is that artefactualness is a property of all kinds of things, not only living, but also inanimate, right? Not only of inanimate living. Both participate in different ways to this sort of strategic interaction with humans. The second aspect is that really artefactualness should not be just understood as a property of things, but a property of their relationship with the different agents that shape them. So here the idea is that artefactualness, and we will really insist on that, is kind of negotiated between agents, human, non-humans, whose actions do affect, let's call it the morphogenesis, how form comes into being of the artifacts. Please take here morphogenesis not in the strict biological sense, but in the broader sense of genesis of form. Okay, so how could you, what's the problem when you start thinking that there's interaction between such different heterogeneous agents like humans, animals, plants, stones, metals, whatever you want to introduce in this kind of interaction, right? Well, first, when you talk about interaction, this is important. You always have humans, but also you have non-human, at least one non-human agent. And what happens is that these different agents have radically different perception of the world, can leverage on extremely different available actions, and are differently aware of the interaction. Von Uexküll would have said they have different Umwelts, right? They live in different worlds in a way. So how can they communicate and interact in any reasonable way is a crucial question, of course. It's not obvious because most ideas we have about interaction are often based on some type of compatibility between the different agents. And we will look in a moment to how we try to answer to that also in our case. The second important thing is that when you talk about agents, you tend to talk about strategies, right? So we want to understand it as a kind of strategic interaction, very much in the sense of game theory, if you want, although we will specify how. So the idea here is that agents have strategies where strategies are actions conditional on their perception of the world. Given what you can perceive of the world, of the states of the world, right, you will trigger some action. Clearly, for example, roots of plants trigger different actions conditional on different perception of the state of the world, as well as we do as humans. It is quite common, for example, in evolutionary game theory to say that plants or animals have strategies, right, which are not necessarily intentional, but they are, how could I say, plan of action, which are embedded in the way that they have given some perception of the states of the world. How do you define then the actions that, these actions which are conditional? Here we resort to concepts that come from what is called sometimes the ecological psychology of Gibson. So the idea of affordances. I don't know how much you're familiar with this very useful notion that tries to bring psychology out of human head and into the relationship with the world. So the idea of affordances is basically that each entity dealing with the environment gets from the environment possibilities of action, fundamentally, opportunities of actions and things that can support or even disrupt the living of such entity, right? Affordances is this, what the environment basically allows you to do, given your action possibilities, right? So it's a relational property of what you perceive in the environment. It's not something detached from you. It's not just a property outside you. It's a relational property of how entities relate to the environment. And from this point of view, there are affordances and constraints, things that you cannot do, of course. And this will also be important to define the space of possible strategies. Okay, so where does interaction happen? It happens in what we might define as a context, right? Kind of environmental interaction. And these different entities, although they might not understand each other or not even conceive each other, maybe a tree has no idea of what a man is, although of course trees have complex perceptual processes. But they are in a context that they share, and they can act on this shared context that thus becomes the interface through which interaction happens. And how do they do it? By basically modifying, right, the context, and thus creating new affordances or destroying affordances. So the result of action is basically a dynamic in the affordances provided by the context, right? And you can do it directly. For example, You could modify the shape of the plant, or some food might modify some processes into your body. Or sometimes also indirectly, you can modify affordances provided by the context, like when you fertilize soil. So there are different types, of course, of interaction, but the key point is that the context is what mediates, of course, the interaction of those agents. And a very important property to stress is that agents are not detached from the context. They are themselves part of the context, so they are part of the modification. So, for example, an artifact that you modify could be part of one of the agents involved, like when you modify a tree or some material. Okay, so what happens as actions modify the context, right? Well, the basic idea is that all these things, to some extent, they modify, as I said, affordances and constraints available to agents. In this sense, action interwave continues. They redefine what you can do and what you can do, what the other can do, and they depend on it, sort of like in a DNA string, if you want. And what is interesting here is that some actions are especially relevant because they introduce some sort of irreversibility, in the sense that at some point, these sort of interwaving actions get tied, right, together by something that is no more undoable. Think of changes of state of matter, like becoming solid or becoming rigid rather than elastic. But also there can be social kind of sort of discontinuities, like rites of passages, for example, that affect initiation, right, that makes you an adult rather than a child in tribal life or whatever. These kind of discontinuities, let's call them kind of state transition or phase transitions, are very close to what Hodder, as I mentioned before, calls the entanglement, the way things entrap them each other in a way that makes it very hard to get back from the previous interaction. And such transition also temporarily define what we perceive as the form, right, and the materiality of an artifact. They define also the degree, if you want, of artefactualness of the artifact, or relatively stable phases that can evolve, change again, and change in a way the rules of the game, if you want to talk in that way. Okay, I should make it very short because it's really time now to move to the case study. But before doing that, let me tell you that we think that looking at artefactualness rather than artifacts can help to capture some general phenomena, and the way we can think in a broader way about artifacts, although most of the talk will be about a specific artifact, which is living root bridges. But just to generalize for a moment, we think that one nice way to capture the effects of this interaction is to look at, or how interaction happens, is to look at two dimensions that characterize, in a way, the continuum of artefactualness. One is, let's call it material factors. Material factors are those to which you give us a shape, right? And in a way, they can differ enormously in terms of how relevant is human intervention in the nature of materials. You can move from absolutely natural entities where humans did never affect, in a way, their shape or entity, although this is becoming rarer and rarer on the Earth, or to extremely synthetic things where all materials are entirely transformed in a way by human action, like plastic, probably. So in a way, artefactuality can differ very much in terms of how much an artifact has natural or synthetic matter. But matter is not an artifact. They need to take a shape, they need a form to be artifacts. And there are morphogenetic factors that characterize artefactualness as well, because you can go from an extreme of natural morphology, that where the whole shape is determined only by biological processes unaffected by humans, again, more and more rare on Earth, to the extreme case where, of course, the whole shape is designed and produced by human intervention. If you think of this, you can easily imagine that there are different trajectories of artefactualness in the world, over which you could classify or imagine how to locate different objects that surround us. Maybe the most classical trajectory we have in mind is the manufacturing of synthetic objects, where plastic bottles tend to be extremely synthetic and all designed by humans on their morphogenetic, right, dimension. But you have clay pottery, where you have a stronger role of natural materials, and also materials act on those that shape objects. For example, in interaction between the potter and the clay on the wheel, right? It's a real interaction between the material and the potter, or even more in stone axes and so on. But you have other trajectories, like the one Darwin was describing, where basically the material remained biological and natural, but the shape is more and more affected by humans, like Darwin's sheep are probably here at the intermediate level, and genetically modified organism, or Dolly, the sheep, is on the extreme right side of human interventions in the design of those natural materials. Or you can have the opposite trajectory, where basically most of the design is animal or natural, but humans provide synthetic reproductions of this process, like in biomimesis, artificial protocells, or things like that. And basically that gives you a first idea of how we could think of artefactualness as really a continuum over which different things happen in different ways. What we will try to do later on is to do something much more concrete, to look at a specific type of artifacts and how it moves into these dimensions of artefactualness under the interaction of the different agents that characterize it. And that's where really the interesting story starts, and I will leave to Costanza to take my place, and I go back to my real name on the other computer. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Massimo. Yes, I don't know if you want to make a question now or at the end. Probably it's better at the end. Well, since I didn't have any answer, let's continue. So now, yes. So now, thanks, Massimo, for the introduction. I will now go on with a concrete example. We thought about this sort of a negotiation game that happens between humans and, let's say, the entities from which you can develop artifacts, that is bread. Indeed, bread is a very peculiar artifact known since centuries, and actually really having this relationship between the baker, so the human actant, and another living entity, in this case, the yeast, so the fungi Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And actually what is interesting is how the knowledge dating back centuries of humans managed to basically exploit the reproduction strategies of yeast and their digestion strategies in order to making flour rise. And how does this happen? Well, basically with really an interaction, because of course yeast needs food, so it needs to have nutrition in order to reproduce itself. And so flour, yeast, water, and a little bit of salt or sugar, depending on how you want to make it rise. And then humans knows that mixing it will allow the yeast to get in contact with the nutritional particles of the flour, the sugar and the water, and this will trigger the digestive process that will allow yeast to grow, so to replicate itself, and at the same time to produce anidride carbonica, rising the mud of the bread. And the problem is that this modification doesn't really happen all the time the way we hope, because not only you need to have the right things in the right order, but you need also to have contextual characteristics that follow the needs of this rising process, that actually are temperature, the right humidity, and so on. And this is why once you start the process of baking, so mixing the flour with the yeast, there are phase transition where you cannot go backward. And if something goes wrong, eventually you won't get the bread. Anyway, let's now move forward to our, I'm sorry, I don't know why it's, okay. Let's move forward to our case study. So why did we consider living root bridges as the ideal, let's say, case to study this entanglement and this artefactualness of things? Well, because from their shape, we can already see how the process of interaction between humans and things happens. And actually, if we move to the context where living root bridges happens, we realize how they are really a peculiarity of a very small region of the world. They are found only in the East Hills is one province of the state of Meghalaya. Meghalaya is one state in northeastern India, just above Bangladesh. And in the Hiskazi Hills, what is interesting is that monsoons finish their ride, and so it's one of the rainiest area of the world. And the actors that are involved in the creation of these artifacts, so living root bridges, are Wars. The Wars are a tribal population that we will take into consideration later on, and then Ficus Elastica, or the rubber tree. Okay, so the context, again, of the Hiskazi Hills is really shaped by the monsoons. Indeed, it is a very hilly environment characterized by steep slopes, by many rivers that, as you can see in the image, seems to run very quietly and pacifically, but actually during the monsoon season, they become strong and very dangerous to be crossed. And of course, there are many forests, subtropical forests that grow in this area. And what is interesting, and that you can see in the photo here, there is a bamboo bridge, because apart from living root bridges, the local population usually uses bamboo bridges to cross these rivers and to reach all the parts of the forest and the villages. The problem of bamboo bridges is that during the monsoons, the current of the rivers might destroy them and take them away, since they're very light and fragile. And at the same time, bamboo also, with all the rain, risks to rotten easily. And so this is why probably centuries ago, Kazis thought of developing different artifacts that could help them cross the rivers. And let's now look at the Vars. The Vars are this tribal population living in the forest. They're one of the few matrilineal population remaining worldwide. And as you can see in the market, females are the one conducting trading. But most of all, what is interesting about their culture is that they really live in close contact with the forest. Indeed, we can say that they are hunter-gatherers, and everything that they hunt or gather or somehow cultivate, but in a very different way from our cultivation strategies in the forest, is then traded in the market that we've seen before. And what is interesting, again, is their cultural and religious approach, that is animist. Animism, we know from anthropology, and especially from Vieira de Castro, can be defined as an ontology that postulates a social character to relation between humans and non-humans. So a culture where the space between nature and society is itself social. So this means that the relationship that was defined with their context, so with the forest, where they live, is itself social. So non-humanities can be considered as endowed with agency. And a very peculiar example is debris. Debris is the way the Vars call their own, the forest where cultivate or where they gather the things that they need for their survival. And what is interesting about debris is that it is really a concept that is far away from our culture. Indeed, debris is forest, as we perceive it, is instead a blurred concept, wild and the domesticated meat. And indeed, it can be defined as a unique production system in which economically useful trees are managed within natural forest. And what is interesting about debris is the strategic context where Vars develop their strategies in terms of building construction of bridges. And okay, we are missing a very beautiful image for I don't know what problem, but the other element of the let's say game that occurs in developing living root bridges is of course the tree. So Ficus Elastica. Ficus Elastica was defined by Wallace as the most extraordinary tree of the forest. Ficus Elastica is the tree from which you can extract rubber. And actually, it is a very peculiar fig, not only because you can extract from it rubber, but also because it is part of a family of the strangled figs. And strangled figs have very peculiar strategies that have been studied in botany that allows them to survive very well in a tropical or subtropical environment. Indeed, they have allows them to start high. So basically, animals and birds eating the seeds of Ficus Elastica leave these seeds with their poo on the branches of other trees. And so the germination begins from a higher level, allowing the figs to get faster access to light. And at the same time, the fig lets aerial roots falling down the host tree that then will buttress the ficus structure. And once they reach the earth, they respond, changing status, becoming thicker and strong, so ficus. And moreover, aerial roots have another set of strategies that is very interesting, that are given by meshing and allofusion. So basically, the figs is able to recognize itself and to merge its part when they meet. And actually, if we consider these strategies in terms of actions, we can say that first of all, there is botanical terms, the grow. So when the aerial roots touches the ground, the structure of the flexible aerial root becomes solid and thick. And then again, the capability of merging, so to recognize their own parts and merge them one into the other. And once the negation of form to give rise to living root bridges, we can see how different these two actants are. First of all, they're both living, but what is that the plants have a movement that is given by growing. And growing is also endowed with another peculiarity compared to the human one, because it's a slow process, while human action is very discrete compared to the length of life of a tree. And actually, what the VARs have understood is that strategically moving and directing the growth of aerial roots, they could shape the trees in order to develop living root bridges. So how living root bridges are developed? First of all, of course, we will need a river to be crossed. And so we will need to find the background affordances, so having a plant of figs ready to be transformed into a bridge. Then there will be this process of directing the growth of aerial roots to cross then we will need to start building the construction, the actual shape of the bridge in order to be walkable. And then there will be the process of care and maintenance of the bridge. And then at the end, we will look at possible endings of the bridge. We have said the first background affordance was needed in order to develop living root bridges is to have a rivers to be crossed. And most of the time, rubber trees enjoy growing close to the rivers because of the water there, and moreover because of rocks, since they love to anchor themselves on something solid. But this sometimes happens not where humans need actually a safe crossing trail. And so this is why most of the time they grow small ficuses, as the one you can see here in the picture, in order to plant them in river clefts in order to develop in future a bridge. And once the tree is there, there will be the need to join the river shores. And how to do this will continues is a strategy of growth, since it wants to develop itself and keeps growing. And the humans instead will start pulling the aerial roots in order to have them growing horizontally instead of vertically. And what is interesting is that these activities are mainly done by the bridge makers. So bridges are not developed from the beginning to the end by the community of the wars, but there are only few persons who can start actually a bridge. And joining the river shore is very important because once the aerial roots reach the other side of the first phase transition, so it will become rigid, triggered by secondary growth. And in order to join the river shores, most of the time, the bridge makers develop structures, so affordances somehow for the aerial roots that force the growth of aerial roots, the vertical standard strategy. And once the root reaches the soil on the other side of the shore, it starts secondary growth. So the aerial root from flexible becomes rigid and becomes very strong since it starts finding nutrients from the soil and it starts thickening in order to make the whole structure of the tree more robust and resilient to the gravity. And this allows the bridge makers to create the bridge mesh so that they over which you cross the rivers. And again, this is an action that is done mainly by bridge makers only. And usually it is created a great scaffold using wood and bamboo in order to arrange and set on this scaffold the aerial roots that the plant keeps producing. And again, the plant will go ahead with its own slow strategy of growth, keep growing aerial roots. But actually what is interesting is that the ability of the plant to self-recognize itself triggers the merging of these big mess of roots into something more solid. And once this mesh is consolidated, this will allow, of course, crossing. But how does this happen? So why should the plant invest resources in the emerging bridge? We try to understand this speaking with many bridge makers because apparently it's a very hot topic debate among them since the great scaffolds are often covered with leaves or rotten wood or soils because apparently triggering, so nurturing the plant will allow a faster growing. And since this, in order to have the bridge walkable, you will just basically need to wait time. This apparently fastens the process. And once the mesh is created and the path is nearly ready to be walked about, the plant, of course, keeps growing. So the only thing humans have to do is to wait. But once the structure is there, what happens from the wars is that they change also their activities towards the bridge maintenance and growth. So they start working together in the maintenance of the bridge, and they do it by taking care of the structure, putting the aerial roots in the right position. And usually this happens with the three main set of actions that are linked to their knowledge also of bamboo weaving, that is braiding, meshing, and knotting. So they braid, mesh, and knot aerial roots in order to keep the consolidation of the structure directed toward their needs, so to allow a safe crossing. And also they start somehow embellishing the structure, for instance, with the handrails that are also security, because they allow people not to fall down, or they even insert stones in the grid in order to have the walkability safer for the future. And then, of course, there will be the need to taking care of the bridge, because the bridge is alive, is a living entity endowed with the plant, and the actions are mainly used in order to keep away growing plants from the path that is used to crossing. And also they need to protect the plant to be attacked, let's say, by other villagers that will probably extract rubber from the tree. And what is interesting is that here, care is really not a process of maintenance, so our traditional conception of fixing things, but actually is really a process of taking care. So also repairing a bridge that was accidentally broken is a process of regrowing the bridge. And actually, how can a bridge end? Well, of course, because of natural death. So the plant can die because of old age or because it is hit by natural accidents. For instance, there is a lightning or there are fires in the forest. But again, it can end instead for human exploitation, because if people start extracting rubber in an excessive way from the plant, it might die. Or again, for human neglect. So if humans stops taking care of the bridge, as you can see here in the image, plants will start growing on the pathway, and this won't allow the bridge to be a bridge anymore. So as you've seen, living root bridges are really something that challenge somehow our catalog of the world, and we have tried to develop a theoretical framework to understand these artifacts that are, let's say, not so traditional to our world, but at the same time that are really an example of how the artificial can be developed in a way that is really tangible in time. And actually, we thought that all these case study can offer us some very interesting reflection and new perspectives on the design. Indeed, grounding again on a very nice text, we really see in the development of living root bridges a different notion of making that is shifted more toward a different notion that is can be defined as making as growing, where growing is setting up the condition and question proceed. So really on how humans set up the context where the artifact can emerge. And words from Alam and Ingold, the form of the artifact emerge like forms of living beings within the relational context of the mutual involvement of people and their environments. So again, there is this idea of somehow negotiating the shape of the artifact. And this is why we would like to conclude to consider design not so much as designing things, but as design. Because as we have seen, matter is somehow alive, or for sure is responsive. So not necessarily all living materials, but also traditional matter that is used for developing artifacts. We can think of, for instance, glass. Glass starts from sand, but if you heat it to a certain temperature, so if you change the context where this matter is, it changes its shape, becoming, and going back to a colder temperature, it becomes solid back again. So giving shape to matter, the designer should really attune with what the matter allows, but also with the time scale of this phase transition. This is why we consider design as becoming an act of seeing what is possible. So to imagine the possibilities you can develop with the matter you are touching, negotiating the form of the artifact itself with the matter itself. This is why we are suggesting that design should change in designing not things, but with things. And with this, we have concluded, and thank you very much for having listened to us. Here,
I can stay here.
or if you want to have questions. Okay, grazie, thanks for the suggestion, but I didn't look at the... And if someone wants to add something, just either turn on the microphone or write on the chat. We are here for suggestions, comments, and critiques. Anything you might want to add.
Yeah, I would have, if I can, a couple of comments. First of all, congratulations. Enjoyed a lot your presentation. Can you hear me?
I hear you very well. May you retry, like re-ask the question? I think we had an internet problem here. In the chat, we see that Jonathan has... No, Maria is back. Okay, perfect.
Okay, can you hear me now? Otherwise, I can just write. Okay, first of all, I really enjoyed your really insightful, yes, and a nice like way of thinking between natural construction, action, and so on. Regarding the problem of intention in building up human artifacts and so on, is interesting because sometimes there's some kind of difference used when you have to make a difference between, for example, an artistic gesture and a gesture just to build up things.
Maria, sorry, we have I think my computer, so see if we can do it on Massimo's one. 1 second.
Yeah, maybe I can just write, no problem.
Now we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. It's interesting the problem of intentionality and so on, because this is sometimes used as concept when you have to make difference between, for example, a gesture in an artistic domain and a gesture in some non-artistic domain. Regarding the duality between, for example, human design and natural morphology, is quite fascinating because sometimes there can be like mutual connection between them. For example, in the case when an artist or some human design is deliberately trying to imitate a natural structure. So yes. And for example, also in the case when there is a beautiful natural structure, so the human design is trying to imitate, or when we can analyze a human design and retrieve some suggestion from nature. The last thing regarding, yes, the making the objects is interesting because for one side in the scheme you shown in the presentation, there were natural constructions. There were also artifacts made by humans and so on. But we can also in this case can have, well, maybe we can describe them with some kind of natural transformation in category theory, because it is the case, for example, of chimpanzees or apes that are creating some very simple tools. So they are like members of the natural world who are manipulating part of the natural world, but to create some tools. For example, this is the case that like some apes and chimps and so on that were using like sticks to grab some insects, some ants, and so on. It's fascinating because they are using in the same way as a human would use them, but it's a completely like non-artificial situation because it's not human, but it's like behaving like human. So just like a very few comments.
If I may react to this comment, I think there's a very interesting problem. Once you start trying to understand these interactions between different agents, a very interesting problem is similarity and dissimilarity in their actions. And I know you have been working on this problem of similarity of actions, right, in different contexts or modalities. So it's true that in some cases you have this sort of imitation process, of course, right? But in other cases, I think actions are radically different in their shape, right? So the action of a root growing is somehow different from human actions, but man can learn, and that's the other interesting thing that we could observe, to transfer gestures from one domain to the other one, but apply them to entirely different processes. So for example, it's interesting that most bridge builders are also excellent bamboo craftsmen. So they have learned the basic gestures of, you know, waving, of knotting and so on, and they transfer them into the way they can conceive it, but they do it in a very different way. That's the interesting transformation you have here, because to do it on a tree, on a living tree, you are no more acting on a dead matter, but on a matter that grows. So the interesting point, I think, here is how do you understand how human gestures can be applied to a growth process, right? And transfer from a very different. So I think you're right. If you look into this sort of mutual action or interaction, an important thing is to understand how similarity or transfers or transformations of action between the two agents happen, right? In some cases you have imitation, in some others you have very different, by the way, processes, and I think that's also very interesting. I think the other aspect that you implicitly raise is how do this different action might intertwine, which is also a very interesting story. So it's the sort of mutually twisting activities you are familiar with from other domains, I think. And I think it would be very, we haven't been trying to sort of formalize the framework, but we wish we could do it. We have some idea about a more computational approach, sort of agent-based approach to distributed morphology. But of course, it would be interesting also to see it in more abstract terms, as you suggested, by using tools like natural transformations or other kind of tools. So yeah, that would be one of the most exciting things for us, is to move a little bit from a verbal statement of the framework to a more formal one. And so yeah, thanks. Jonathan has
a question, then Duncan, and then Peter.
Hi, thanks for the fascinating talk. Yeah, I have a question about, these seem like quite long-term projects to build a tree. You mentioned 12 years. I don't know if that's the time scale, if that's exactly the time scale from planting to when it's safe to cross, or what the time scale is, but it seems like long-term, which implies certain social structures. You need continuity, some kind of continuity, or is it the same builder? How many builders? How is the, you know, this kind of practical knowledge passed down? It's curious because it's such an interesting case. It must imply some interesting social structures, whatever. So that would be my question. Thank you.
So, well, of course, build a bridge is not a quick thing. And actually what we found in speaking with many bridge makers is that it is really a process of intergeneration exchange. So what the bridge makers really like about this process of making bridges is that they're not doing the bridge for themselves only, but for the clan, so for their family, and their sons and their sons of their sons and so on. Family for the bars, it's a very important social element, and actually they're called the clans, and they proceed in a matrilineal way. So basically it's all the opposite from our patrilineal approach, because everything is inherited by the youngest niece, no, nipote.
The daughter, the youngest daughter.
Okay, the youngest daughter. So it's very, yes, there is this social structure that probably allows a different approach compared to ours. So a long-term approach in developing such structures.
Yeah, you could also say another thing, I think, which is in this case, just like humans are driving in a way some features of the tree is driving some intergenerational feature of humans, right? They provide a sort of support to, it's very much like, I think, medieval cathedrals from this point of view. It takes 2 generations at least to get fully working, and then goes over centuries. And it's important to note that if you don't keep working on the bridge, the bridge will never more exist. It will become again just a tree. So the point is, when you have 500 years old bridges, you know that for 500 years, people had to keep it growing and orienting its growth. So it's an entirely different thing from saying using a bridge. You know, we can have a bridge and just use it. But there, if you just use it, it stops being a bridge very quickly. So it's also sort of transfer of care processes over a generation that can last for centuries. And I think it's a quite amazing support they provide to sort of continuity of social relationships. So yeah, I agree with you. It's interesting to see the relationship of these things to the time of social interactions, also among humans, and they really provide some structure to it, which is recognized by people.
Yes, and adding to this, actually, there is really this idea of entanglement. If you look at the bridge in terms of an element of the landscape, again, so as a sort of a monument, if you want, a living monument, because it really bows the person who are willing to use it to take care of it. Otherwise, it won't become useful anymore.
Are certain bridges, are they associated with certain families? Like a certain
It depends.
It depends.
Depends on the ownership structure that has evolved over centuries also. So traditionally there was no real private property, but the colonialism brought some form of property, which means that in some cases the bridges are associated to the owners of the shores, basically. But there's a very interesting point that I think is really connected to the animistic culture there. In some villages, not all, if you ask who's the owner of the bridge, people will tell you, well, there are 3 owners of this bridge. The guy owning this shore, the guy owning the shore, but the center of the bridge is owned by the water, by the river, which is rooted in the belief that the river is actually a deity and can be in a way a sort of juridical subject in the process. It really owns the center of the bridge. So yeah, also the ownership structure is very interesting because it reflects the idea that not only humans, but also natural elements can be owners, also in a sort of juridical sense.
Thank you.
Duncan?
Yeah, thanks for the fascinating talk. I'm interested about, again, I think to echo Jonathan's point, I think there's sort of the social element is something that I feel like is really important here, and that could be drawn out further, that there is, you know, you gestured towards sort of actor network theory, but, you know, thinking through the key names there, say Deleuze and Guattari, it's always nestings of assemblages or nestings of assemblages, and that the relevance of the social element would really, that seems to be really crucial. But again, going back to the choice of the case, I'm interested, you know, it's a very charismatic case, but I'm interested to see how you might think about this in relation to, say, I'm thinking maybe, you know, in a European context, the ways in which trees have been grafted in different ways and their growth being technologized, say, in the production of fences, for instance, for millennia. So there are similar things which might produce interesting conversation between the sites or cases. Yeah, Giuseppe Pannoni's work, yeah, that's good, Emiliano. That's really relevant there. And then I'm also thinking about then coming to Venice, about how one might think about this in relationship to canals. You know, they're often thought about as being some, you know, there's an interesting relationship there between the human intervention and the water flowing, and how the water flows and how it's directed, the processes of dredging and the interactions between the canal or the riverway, the waterway as it already exists, and how it is then manipulated and shaped. But how there's a kind of dual agency there, right? There's an interaction between the two. But yeah, more about like the choice of case and whether you're, you know, and how that might then speak to other cases that are relevant.
Okay, so well, I'd start with your last point. So let's say a possible connection between Venice and the canals. I think somehow yes, but we need to consider that we are working with different kind of agencies here, like in Venice, because of course there is the water that can be considered an agent, but at the same time we are in a cultural context that has somehow de-agentified the water. So we really, if we want to use, let's say, the same model, probably we will need to look at very specific categories of people, for instance, probably fishermen, who have a different, more in-depth relationship with the waters compared, for instance, to normal citizens or tourists that actually leave Venice a lot on the ground, because Venice has become a walkable city rather than let's say, a water city, having changed its structure from when the Ponte della Libertà was built. So there can be connection, but again, we will need to reconsider and reset the overall context to study who really are the agents. Like, we cannot make a too poor translation of a model, I think, in this context. We really need to rethink all the categories that we are using. And I don't know if I really got the first point that you made. I think I've understood that you wanted to say something like, are there other examples closer to us of this kind of, let's say, production of artifacts? Is it correct? Okay. Well, in Europe, I have to say, I don't know. But for sure, there are other cultures that do things similar to living root bridges. I think, for example, in Peru, at the border to Bolivia, there are these tribes that live on these floating islands made of this grass that grows into the lake. And basically everything, so their infrastructure, the islands where they live, is made by this grass that is collected, braided, and set up and anchored to the bottom of the lake. And so again, there is a very symbiotic life with the nature, because of course everything is done by knotting this grass. So for sure we will need to explore if there are other cases in Europe, but so far I don't know at the moment, and I don't know Massimo.
Well, I would take a slightly different perspective on it. I think, can we use this sort of animistic experiences to look at our own experience in different terms? And we don't need to become animists, of course. I wouldn't even desire that, honestly. But I think we can learn something about how to look at things. So think to the example you made of the city. I agree with you. There's a lot of interaction between the shaping of the city and the action of many natural agents. And we still struggle with that. Think to the high tide phenomenon, how they are, in a way, continuously interacting with the way we shape and reshape the city, the lagoon, and so on, right? So certainly, it's interesting to look, although we don't do it enough. I would think it would be a proper ecological perspective, of course, to a situation where you have multiple agents, which are not necessarily humans, and read again phenomena we are familiar with in those terms, and we might discover something. Let me tell you one interesting episode. Last year, there was a dramatic high tide in 2019, and there was a very spontaneous organization of kind of rescue activities or whatever, right? During that activity, for what we could observe and see, it came out that the materiality of the high tide, its effect, the things that went around and so on, drove a lot many social coordination processes. So people, rather than coordinating by instruction by other humans, were instructed almost literally by the materials they were facing, right? So they were rediscovering, in a way, I think, a much more social relationship with water, with the damages, with the things, with all these kind of things. Maybe this lasted just for a moment. It was, it didn't leave a trace, I don't know, maybe it did leave a trace in people's mind, but clearly in that moment, interaction with the natural elements was a sort of peer interaction, was a social interaction, not just intervening through. Actually, the real coordinator was those elements, not humans, for the first 2 days at least. Then it became a more human-driven coordination process. So I think there are episodes in which we can rediscover that. The other example that I like, I think, now we are facing a huge artifact, Mose, right? I think it's really time to be critical and start thinking, what kind of artifact is it and how can we consider it, right? Is it just the nth example of human intervention over a passive nature? Or how could we think differently the nature of this artifact, the way it interacts with humans, with water, with fishes, with plants, with whatever? So can we have a proper perspective on what Mose is that goes beyond this naive view of technology, if you want, as just a designer imposing shape over nature? I don't think it works that way. And I think having a critical reading of this phenomena needs a different lens. We don't need to be animists to develop a new lens, I think, but we can learn from that in a way that, yes, we are in a social relationship with those elements in some way, and we should take that into account. So that would be my reaction to your comment. Heather.
Hello. Okay. So I'm wondering about how these different theories or descriptions of agent-based. I think somebody. I think somebody else might have some animal songs playing. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so I was wondering, yeah, all these different kind of concepts that try to explain interaction and entanglements and all that kind of stuff. How do they deal with things that are based on energy and different forms of energy, like physical energy and electromagnetic energy? And, you know, in that, I'm even thinking of something Ivor mentioned, wind. So, you know, air currents, water currents, they're affected by infrared energy. But, you know, you can't exactly say like, oh, the wind is the interaction between the agent of, you know, there's no wind god anymore. Like it's, so where is the thingness of, or the agency of something like the wind or an electromagnetic field or even a gravitational field?
Sorry, I would really like to jump on that. I think it's a very important point. We could only mention that very shortly at the beginning, but much of what we observe in our case was shaped well before trees and men, shaped by monsoons. Now, monsoons are not things. They are not proper entities. They are events, right? And of course, it's hard to imagine that an event is an agent because that clashes with our, I would say, semantic intuition of what an agent is. But certainly an event is acting upon and shaping the context. So since we give so much weight to this notion of affordances that the environment provides to interaction between things, these affordances are clearly, in the case of the Khasi Hills, most shaped by events, not by persons or by other living entities, right? So if you don't want to call them agents, they certainly anyway play a role in shaping the set of affordances agents can use to build their own life. And I think it's true of wind, it's true of other energetic, if you want, or energy-related phenomena, where it would be hard to have the notion of a thing you can really extract. But still you have agency in the sense there's a lot of action going on and shaping the context, the environment. So I see actually that an advantage of this view, this relational view, is that it leaves much more room to think to the sort of agentic role of things which are not easily identified as agents, like wind or monsoons or rain or high tides, right? So yeah, I'm very sympathetic to your remark, and I think it's a big advantage when you think less about things, more about context in which relations happens, that then you can have a much broader view of agency. And I think in many cases, events are even more important than things like humans or trees, right? And clearly this is the case of monsoon-driven areas. So thanks, I think this is a very important point. We had no time to stress, but I think it's really crucial. Can you read that?
I do not know much about gods, but untamed and intractable by Eliot. And this was written, I think, from Barbara, but it's not a question.
But we can comment on that, nevertheless.
Yes.
Actually, it was only a quick note when you said that they consider the river like a god. That verse came to mind. I think you can skip to the questions after that. It was just a bit of poem that came to my mind.
Yeah, rivers have an incredible role in the Var religion. They are goddesses, not gods, actually. So their gender is female. And they have many important properties. Not only they are goddesses in an abstract term, they are very concrete. So they, as many natural elements, they have a reciprocity relationship with humans. So their action as gods is very well qualified. So for example, if you, in a way, offend the river can get revenge out of you by drowning you, for example. But it's interesting that the way they express it, it was very nice to hear that, I remember, from an old lady. She was not saying, if you don't respect the river will drown you. But she was saying, as we can drink the water of the river can drink us. So there was this deeper symmetry in the way they were describing this interaction that I thought was quite fascinating, was emphasizing this sort of notion there's always a symmetry and reciprocity between natural entities and humans and sort of social relationship. The river can protect you, but then you need to protect the river and so on. So, of course, the state of being a god is very interesting for rivers, and it emphasizes, if you want, this possibility of acting on you. Okay, that's so. I think this is a very important point. Okay, I don't know if it captures some of your remarks, but certainly I think it's an important thing. And it affects how people speak about rivers in a deep way, so they understand how rivers act. Long text in the chat. Pennone, art.
But I don't know what does Pennone do.
Oh, he does work with by carving basically the structural trees and getting something out of it. But we can comment maybe later on that. Duncan has also a comment. I'm thinking of the training of trees to build hedgerows for millennia in farming practice, which protect crops from wind, for instance. Yes, there's a lot of practices in training very different type of trees or shrubs to create barriers, to create other things. It's an old tradition. I think Europe has a long tradition in manipulating those elements. If we look at Middle Age culture, it was much more animistic than we think, after some respect, I think. And many of these practices are Middle Age old, and they imply an understanding of your interaction with plants as growing things like them. So to give you a simple reaction, I think, yeah, there's a lot of things like that. We have been, over time, increasingly substituting living ingredients of infrastructure with dead ingredients. We don't use anymore much, at least much anymore, growing trees or shrubs to build barriers. We kill the tree and we use the wood, for example. And this is a typical transformation in attitude, but we have many, many traces of a more traditional ancient culture in Europe, which is using actually living things to create infrastructures. And I think, yes, that's completely true. We have many remnants of that. We don't have a full inventory of these things in Europe, but it would be very interesting to have. But I belong to a different conception of how you can grow rather than make with dead things. Monsoon Assemblages project at Westminster University to think about the Monsoon Beyond event. Okay, thanks, we will look. I'm not aware of this project. P.S. Jonathan, I'm not super, sorry?
No, because at the end there is a question from Monica.
Yes, but there was also Jonathan one.
A suggestion?
Oh, 4 quartets. Okay, that's again on Eliot, the later Eliot. The river is within us. Okay, I have
and
no.
the sea is all around us. by Barbara. And then
yeah, Monica, you have a small question. Sorry.
Yeah. Just a question. I probably already asked you something about, but maybe not so precisely. So is there any organization of the design job around bridges, or do you have just makers of bridges and all the population who is taking care, or is there any kind of specialization in the job around the bridge?
You want to answer, Costanza?
So what is very, very interesting is that bridge makers really have everything in their head. And what is, I think, much more interesting is that the works don't have any figurative culture. So they don't make drawings. And this is very astonishing because at least I think I traveled kind of quite a bit in my life, and it's the first time also then when you enter a museum you don't find illustrations, and also in the villages the only characteristic that you can see as a regularity between bridge makers is that usually they're not only bridge makers, they're also good musicians. And they're usually good in carving musical instruments and or building and waving baskets, so waving bamboo. And apparently what they do, it's really a mystery for the rest of the village. I assisted to one of a bridge maker who was taking care of this new emerging bridge. And all the guys that were with me, that were my guides, were totally lost in what he was doing. And apparently he really had a vision of his own that no one else could understand. And probably this explains why the bridge makers consider themselves also somehow blessed by God for having this capacity to see the bridges and to start the process in building them. So let's say that the design here is really like a sort of God blessing coming from above. And again, the specialization is really linked to these abilities that they have previously, normally linked with the music and bamboo waving. But for instance, of course, they know how to write and they go to school, but there isn't a culture on drawing. At least from the traditional also things that you find in museums. They have a lot of trading, but for instance, they don't have a tradition in waving, also textiles. They buy them, they buy potteries, they buy the things they use in the houses. The only thing that they make is made by bamboo. So I think this is another interesting point that for sure we need further exploration, but of course we need to go back to the field for
I think there's a division of labor, as also Costanza stressed before, between those that initiate the bridge, which are individuals, and those that maintain, which are collective entities. The second one, which is important, the main division of labor in the villages is a gender division of labor. So for example, women go to the market more than men, also because they own economic activities, given a matrilinear society, but they don't climb the trees. So since the most interesting architectural part of living bridges implies some physical ability to climb trees and so on, males do the most, how could I say, architectural part of it, while women on bridges act mostly in sort of taking care of the bridge, cleaning, addressing the handrails, but they don't do the big architectural elements, right? So I think gender division of labor is certainly very relevant. On the other side, they do more or less the same things in the village, with the exception that some do, as Costanza said, special artifacts, and they are those that also usually do the bridges.
And may I ask you if you find that there is a sort of division between the problem-solving part of the staff and the problem framing? Because in reading one of the papers in 2020, one recent paper on the division of design labor with digital digitalization and artificial intelligence, this was this thesis by Berganti and others, that there will be a sort of a division of design level between problem solving, which could be given to artificial intelligence and algorithms, while problem framing should be given to designers framing the problems. I don't believe in this kind of division. I think that this is an artificial division. I think my impression is that design is made of both the parts, problem solving and problem framing, as part of the same process. But I was wondering if in your situation, in your specific situation, do you see any kind of separation between problem solving? Maybe maintenance should be considered as problem solving and problem framing as the architectural dimension, the architectural knowledge about how to.
No, I think you have there a very traditional society where problem framing is mostly given by tradition. So most of the elements are framed by many generations' effort to consolidate in the culture, even in the language elements that frame the problem. And there is very little apparent change in problem framing, while problem solving is, of course, ubiquitous because you have to, but it's very related to your ability. You don't solve the problem alone, because you have to solve the problem, for example, together with the tree, because you cannot do it alone. There's nothing you can do alone, right? The tree is growing, is very independent from what you do. There's a nice nickname for the tree, for the rubber tree, which is the tree that can do whatever he wants, right? He's a very independent and anarchical kind of agent. And you have to get to compromise with the tree if you want to solve something. So problem solving is always a cooperative activity with the tree in the case of bridges. So I don't think so. What is changing now is the impact of a different culture. So a new problem framing has been introduced by tourism. So now, for the first time, bridges are no more just a solution to the problem of crossing the river. They also bring in money because sometimes visitors come to see them. So now the bridge has become something different. So you can decorate it more, right? Because you want to attract people and so on. But this is a sort of induced element that has come only in the last 5-6 years as a result of these bridges becoming sort of popular in the press and getting some attention. But this is very different from, you know, the traditional problem setting that I think has been mostly dominated by tradition and by beliefs and by what your grandparents did and what you transmit them.
And do you think that in decorating more their trees, they are moving towards a more an idea of artificial design, in the sense of, okay, adding things which are not co-designed or co-built together with?
Well, probably, I think probably only in the fact that now all the bridge makers are trying to understand the strategies to make the bridge grow faster. So probably there is a change in, while before bridges were mainly useful things. So of course it will need time, whatever, I need to cross here, so let's wait for it. While now, since they know that others are interested in these special artifacts, there is some sort of race in who is able to have more bridges, who is the village who has the most beautiful ones, who has the most beautiful and clickable ones, because for photos, remember we are in India, and India is the state with the highest number of people dying for selfies in the world, for instance. So being beautiful is part of the culture that is entering also in this construction process. And what we found is that many of the bridge makers have their own solution to how to make the routes, especially the first route, cross faster from one shore to the other. Because once you have this first route, then the process is just really going on. But probably this is the only thing that has changed, I think, from at least what we have seen in the few times we've been there.
I think there are no more questions, and we are a little bit beyond a reasonable time limit.
Yes.
So I think it's time to say a big thank to all participants if there are no other questions. And please join us if you have other things you want to discuss or have, because we are, as I told you, for us, this is really a first moment in which we hope to get some food for going on and developing the project and so on. The project has many other sides, but this is an important one, this idea of thinking about the artifacts. So this was for us basically an occasion to get as far as we can our colleagues and friends involved in getting ideas or developing stuff. Or critiques of
that like fragile points we need to develop more.
So thanks a lot for
Thank you.
for all the help and the patience. And see you soon, I hope. Bye. Thanks.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.